Hey there, interwebs, and welcome back to How Fascinating. You've probably noticed that it's January. That means we're past all the festivals of lights, but spring is still months away and everything is frozen and lifeless, so let's talk about death. Of course, it's impossible to talk about death without mentioning the Victorian era, because the latter half of the 19th century in general was a good time for mourning. Queen Victoria's husband Albert died in 1861, and that same year saw the start of the American Civil War, which was rife with mass casualties on both sides. The United States and the British Empire were both plunged into periods of profound grief, and those are the only two sovereignties that count. Let's face it, the people of the late 1800s knew how to grieve. They perfected gloom, and they turned mourning into an art form. Or did they? One of the things I love about this series is that although I created it to share my obscure knowledge with the world, I routinely end up learning more about any subject I choose to make the focus of an episode. Sometimes I'll even know a piece of trivia which I find worthy of a video, but when I start to research it for the script, I'll discover that it's actually a common misconception and that the truth is far more fascinating. This was the case with Robert Liston's 300% mortality rate and the symbolism of the pineapple, which is actually a pine cone, and it's also the case with numerous Victorian death objects, for lack of a better term. Let's begin with post-mortem photographs and posing stands. The story goes that people of the mid to late 19th century photographed their deceased loved ones posed to look as though they were still alive. That's partly true, but only partly. If you look for it, you can sometimes see a strange appliance or piece of furniture in the background of vintage photographs, partially obscured behind the subject. That's a posing stand, and they were a special type of apparatus used to hold a person in place while their photo was being taken. If you've heard of them before now, you are likely informed that they were used specifically to prop up dead bodies into more natural, lifelike poses and conceal their ghastly status. That's the part which is false. If you see a portrait of someone being held by a posing stand, that person is definitely alive. They were alive at the time the photo was taken. They're absolutely dead by now. You may be wondering, why would you need a stand for a living person? The short answer is that because old-timey photographs had long exposure times, they were much easier to screw up by moving. Canes and wheelchairs are mobility aids, but the posing stand was an immobility aid. It held people still as their photo was being taken, and we know that they were alive at the time because, as Cabinet of Curiosities puts it, dead people don't need help standing still. I personally believe that there are two primary factors which contribute to the notion of posing the dead. One, it is absolutely true that people of yore photograph the dead, and two, the living subjects often look subtly off, like something isn't quite right. Maybe the eyes are strange and lifeless, and the body has a blurry, ghostly aura, or the posture is stiff and unnatural. Well, of course the posture is stiff and unnatural. The subject's been clamped into place. If not, they'd move around, and that's where the ghostly blur comes from. The disquieting nature of the eyes is caused by a combination of factors, some physical and some chemical. You see, getting a good picture back then required a long exposure time, but there seems to be some nebulous misconceptions about how long is long exposure. Some sources will tell you that exposure times could be up to half an hour, and that is actually true. Sorta. 30-minute exposure times were employed, but that was almost exclusively for landscape photography. You know, trees, buildings, rolling hills, picturesque lakes, things that tend not to move around on you. When the daguerreotype was invented in 1839, the longest exposure time for portraiture was a minute and a half. By the 1850s, this time had been shaved down to a meager 3 to 8 seconds, but as anyone who's ever tried to photograph a feisty cat can tell you, even 1 second is long enough to screw up the shot by moving, or in this case, blinking. Posing stands could stop the subjects from wavering, but they couldn't stop them from blinking or glancing about. Additionally, because photography was still in its infancy, early chemical processes could alter colors, causing blue eyes to come out as white or leaving limbs dark in order to maintain a clear face. The story goes that people tried to make the dead look like they were still living, but the truth is that the living actually looked dead. When people of the past did have photographs taken of their deceased loved ones, they didn't attempt to conceal the facts. Even if you wanted to use a posing stand to hold up a corpse, two things would prevent this. 1, the posing stand, and 2, the corpse. As we discussed in the forklifts video, form follows function, and the function of posing stands was to arrest small, involuntary movements of an otherwise cooperative person. The crazy contraptions were sets of frames, clamps, and springs made largely out of cast iron and wood, and they weighed between 20 and 25 pounds. That's not exactly light, but they certainly weren't heavy or sturdy enough to support a full-grown adult cadaver. Trying to use one to support literal dead weight is most likely to just result in the broken stand, and I doubt that's what Drowning Pool had in mind when they said let the bodies hit the floor. The other problem with using a posing stand is a little thing called rigor mortis. This is the stage of decomposition where the body goes rigid before it starts to putrefy, and it's why corpses are colloquially known as stiffs. It's also why the name of a bar which caters to the undead in my urban fantasy setting is called Stiff Drinks, but that's neither here nor there. Suffice to say, attempting to manipulate a body into a natural pose for a living person would be a challenge at the very least. Incidentally, this is why funeral suits are sometimes slit up the back. It allows the shirt and jacket to be pulled over the front without having to move the shoulders. Even setting aside the practical issues of arranging a body, there is another way in which we know that posing stands were meant for the living. They said so. Seriously, we're talking about technology from the mid-19th century, less than 200 years ago. Writing shit down was a well-established custom for humanity by then. In addition to the photos, there are also illustrations, patent drawings, and even catalog ads for posing stands, and according to Mike Zahn, who is an avid photographer and Victorian historian, say that 3 times fast, not a single bit of it mentions anything about dead people. For example, this illustration shows a man somewhat awkwardly clamped into his chair, and the caption humorously says, "The position's supposed to be the most comfortable for getting a nice portrait in daguerreotype." The wealth of documentation from the period will hopefully act as the final nail in the coffin of this mortuary myth, but at the heart of every good rumor lies a kernel of truth. Recall that I asserted post-mortem photography really did occur. Because having one's picture taken was relatively rare back then, a post-mortem photograph was often the only photo ever taken of someone, especially if they died before reaching adulthood. In many legitimate post-mortem photographs, the late subject will be lying down in bed with their eyes closed as though they're asleep, and it's likely they'll also be surrounded by flowers and/or mourning family members. They may even already be in their casket just prior to burial. Also, while we're on the subject of burial and family members of the deceased, I'd like to take a moment to discuss the fascinating etymology of the word posthumous and how it differs from the word post-mortem. The latter means after death, but posthumous is a bit more complicated. Humus is Latin for dirt, earth, or soil, and it's where we get words like inhume and exhume. Inhume means to put someone or something in the dirt, i.e. to bury them, and exhume means to dig them back up, taking them out of the dirt. The English word posthumous comes from the Latin word posthumus, but it was originally posthumus with no h. In Latin, the adjective posterus means coming after, from post, meaning after, like postscript. The comparative form of posterus is posterior, and the superlative form is posthumous, which means last, but also had the specific application of referring to the last of a man's children, including any born after his death. This idea of post-mortem children, combined with a misspelling that implied occurrence after burial, gave rise to the idea that posthumous meant following one's death, and these days the word can apply to a child born after the death of the father, a work published after the death of a creator, or simply occurring after death. The next Victorian objet de mort is the lachrymatory, lacrimarium, lacrimosa, or tear catcher. These were small glass vials used to collect tears at funerals, and 1 year later on the anniversary of the burial, these captured tears would be poured out over the grave as tribute. That's one version of the story which I've heard. Another is that these devices were used to determine the length of the mourning period. When all the tears had evaporated, the mourning period was over. Don't think about the obvious fact that the maximum volume of tears one of these vessels could hold would surely evaporate overnight. As you might suspect from these 2 conflicting stories, as well as my introduction at the beginning of this video, these so-called tear catchers are not what popular mythology claims. But what are they for then, if not collecting tears? Well, the answer to that question is usually perfume, but it also partly depends on their era of origin. The original and perhaps best-known lachrymatories of antiquity come from the ancient Mediterranean. I'm talking about Hellenistic Greece, the Roman Empire, and the Egyptian kingdoms. Chemical analyses performed on these bottles' residual remains revealed that many, if not all of these alleged tear catchers were actually unguentaria, vessels which were intended to store unguents, not tears. Your word of the day is unguent, which is a soft, greasy ointment or salve. Because many unguents were often scented, there's also notable overlap with perfumes. In fact, unguents, perfumes, and cosmetics probably shouldn't be considered different categories. They all blended together back in the day, sometimes literally. It's for this reason that the unguentarium is also called a balsamarium, a vessel used to store balsam, which is an aromatic resin derived from plants. Unguentaria and balsamaria became sepulchral objects because many have been found in ancient tombs and other burial sites, but their purpose there is not known for certain. One quite reasonable theory is that they're grave goods, treasures interred with the bodies of the deceased, but much like the vessels themselves, this theory doesn't stand on its own. You see, early unguentaria were shaped like miniature amphorae, but later designs typically fell into one of 2 morphic categories, fusiform and piriform. That's spindle and pear-shaped, respectively. Many of these had round or pointed bottoms, and therefore could not stand upright without the assistance of a special stand, but no such stands have been found in graves with them, nor have we found any stoppers which would prevent the contents of the overturned vessels from spilling out. Theory number 2 is the archaeologist's old standby, ritual purposes. To be fair, in this case it's believed that the ointments and balms contained within the unguentaria were actually used as part of graveside ceremonies and or the preparation of the bodies, hence that word, embalming. Because these vessels have often been found at gravesites, it has given rise to the sentimental idea that they were used to collect tears shed by the mourners. This notion is mentioned in William Shakespeare's tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra, wherein the eponymous Egyptian says to the titular triumvir, "Where be the sacred vials thou shouldst fill with sorrowful water?" Additionally, there are even scriptural references to the practice in the Bible. Psalms 56:8 says, "Put thou my tears into thy bottle," and Luke 7:38 tells us of a woman who had an alabaster jar of ointment and washed Jesus' feet with her tears, although the latter passage does not seem to imply that those were the ointment she was keeping in the jar. As a matter of fact, just about all of the written references we have to vessels used to collect and store tears in ancient times seem to be nothing more than fabricated fantasy, poetic products of artistic license. But what about the tear catchers from later eras? It seems that this practice, if not actually present in the ancient world, nevertheless experienced a measure of popularity in the 19th century. In addition to the widespread idea of tear catchers in Victorian England, I have also encountered a rumor online that women whose husbands left to fight in the American Civil War would save their tears in special bottles until he returned home again. The accumulated tears would then be shown to the husband as proof of how much he was missed. Unfortunately, for those of you who like a good sob story, pun intended, no such practice existed to the extent of our current knowledge. It's disappointing, I know, but the evidence just isn't there. What do you mean it isn't there? I hear you cry. Pun not intended that time. We have an absolute plethora of glass vials from the era. What more evidence could you need? Well, just like with the unguentaria, bottle does not equal tear catcher. To demonstrate my point, allow me to show you something from my own personal cabinet of curiosities. As you can see, it's a small glass vial and it's shaped like a seal. Although the form is a little unconventional, it's still about the right size for an alleged lachrymatory. That's not what it is, though, nor is it an unguentarium. It is, in actuality, an empty mini-bottle which once contained Seehund liquor. Humorous side note, Seehund is the German word for seal, but it literally means seahound or water dog. Despite its interesting shape and value as a knick-knack, it was originally meant to be a disposable item, something which, once its contents were drained, could be casually discarded. Well, the same is true of most supposed Victorian lachrymatories. They were even known as throwaway bottles. Unlike my mini-bottle, however, they didn't contain booze. Much like the mysterious vessels of antiquity, these also contained perfumes. The long, thin, and often elaborately gilded bottles frequently held a sort of essential oil known as attar, most commonly that of rose or lavender. A discerning woman would purchase her fragrance of choice in these bottles, but once she'd returned home, she would decant it into a larger and even fancier reusable bottle on her vanity. These smaller vials were never meant to be refilled and were basically the 19th century equivalent of disposable packaging, hence the name throwaway bottle. Although the notion of tear catchers is entirely made up, there is one last piece of mourning Victoriana which I want to talk about, and this one is real. Sometimes. When I mentioned in the introduction that the folks of yore turned mourning into an art form, I was only speaking slightly metaphorically, because although they never used beautifully sculpted tear catchers, they had other tragic keepsakes which were even more artistic, and not to mention more than a little creepy, too, depending on your taste. The art form in question is most commonly known as hair work, and I'll give you one guess as to the medium. The trend of turning human hair into pieces of art has its roots, again, no pun intended, in practices as far back as the 1600s, but it reached its peak during the 19th century. This was when sentimentality was at its height, said Emily Snedden-Yates, Special Projects Manager at the Mutter Museum and co-curator of their 2018 exhibition, Woven Strands, The Art of Human Hair Work. In England, mourning was practically a fashionable trend following Prince Albert's death, and records show that Queen Victoria had no fewer than 8 pieces of mourning jewelry commissioned which incorporated her late husband's hair. This helped to popularize the practice, which soon made its way across the pond to the United States, where the desire for memorialization was fueled by the innumerable tragedies of the Civil War. It wasn't all doom and gloom, though. According to Yates, the majority of examples have nothing to do with the deceased. Much like vintage photographs, it's true that some pieces were created to serve as memento mori, but most known examples pertain to living people. Hair art was used for everything from family trees to personal gifts for friends. After all, wouldn't getting a friendship bracelet from your bestie made from her own chestnut tresses make it so much more meaningful? Even if you said no, our ancestors would beg to differ. Any antiquarian who knows their trade can tell you that tear catchers, lots of funereal hair art, and most purported post-mortem photographs are a load of nonsense, born from poetic flights of fancy and a morbid fascination with the grim. Why then do these melancholy myths persist? The sad fact, pun slightly intended, is that there are two different interests being served, one lurid and the other lucrative. Those who buy these alleged artifacts just want to own a macabre object if you will, but the people selling them know better. They know that everyone likes a good story, and a good story can quickly turn into an ad campaign, one which turns disposable perfume bottles into collectible tear catchers and old family portraits into valuable works of memento mori. If a lie is worth more than the truth, people will lie. Then victims of that lie will unwittingly spread it until it has completely smothered the facts. The fact is, these antiques are usually real, just not what they're claimed to be. That is to say, the physical objects are genuine 19th century artifacts, but the stories behind them are fabrications. That's why in the world of antiques, and collecting in general, the advice is always buy the object, not the story, because the latter's a lot easier to fake. Thanks for watching, and have a fascinating day.